There is a mark on Gurney Halleck's face that tells a story more brutal than any war ballad he has ever sung. A jagged, discolored line running across the left side of his jaw, livid and permanent, like the land itself had tried to swallow him whole and left a trace of the attempt. It is not the scar of a duel between equals. It is not a soldier's proud battle wound. It is something far darker. It is the brand of a slave. How does a man of music survive the sadistic limestone pits of Giedi Prime? How does someone who weeps openly at the beauty of a ballad become one of the most dangerous fighters in the known universe? The answer is written right there, etched into the skin of his jaw, glowing faintly in certain lights with that sickly chemical luminescence that only an Inkvine whip can leave behind. Today, we trace that scar back to its source. We descend into the suffocating darkness of the Harkonnen slave pits. We feel the weight of limestone dust in our lungs, and we witness the forging of the warrior-troubadour Gurney Halleck. To understand the scar, we must first understand the world that produced it. Giedi Prime is not a planet that was ever meant to inspire poetry. It is a world of perpetual industrial gloom, a place where the sky itself seems to have given up, choked by the emissions of refineries and processing plants that run without pause, without mercy, and without any apparent concern for the living things beneath them. The Harkonnen homeworld is a study in deliberate ugliness, where Caladan, the ancestral seat of House Atreides, breathes with oceans and open sky. Giedi Prime suffocates under its own ambition. It is a machine world, and machines, as the Harkonnens understood better than almost any other great house, run most efficiently when fueled by human misery. The Harkonnens did not merely tolerate slavery. They institutionalized it with a kind of administrative precision that bordered on artistic. The slave population of Giedi Prime was not an unfortunate byproduct of their economy. It was the foundation. And at the very bottom of that foundation, beneath even the factory workers and the processing crews, were the limestone pit laborers. The men and women who descended each morning into the carved-out belly of the planet and did not always come back up. The limestone pits served a dual economic purpose for House Harkonnen. On the surface level, they extracted raw construction materials used across Giedi Prime's endless building projects. The expansion of fortresses, the reinforcement of processing facilities, the laying of roads that connected one industrial nightmare to the next. But the pits served a second, more insidious function. They were a mechanism of control, a place to send those who had become inconvenient, those who had spoken too loudly, those whose families had accumulated some minor debt to House Harkonnen, and those who simply had the misfortune of being in the wrong place when a quota needed filling. The pits did not distinguish between criminals and the innocent. They simply consumed. And it was into this world that a young man named Gurney Halleck was delivered. The precise circumstances of Gurney's enslavement are worth examining carefully because they reveal something essential about both the Harkonnen method and Gurney's character. He was not a soldier captured in battle. He was not a political prisoner with some grand scheme behind his detention. He was, by all accounts, a young man of unremarkable origin, from a minor settlement on Giedi Prime, someone who had grown up with music in his hands and loyalty in his heart, and who made the catastrophic error of existing within reach of Harkonnen administrators who needed bodies for the pits. His sister was taken first. The details in the canonical record are sparse, and deliberately so, because Frank Herbert understood that some horrors communicate more powerfully through absence than through explicit description. What we know is that she was taken into the household of the Harkonnens, which in the context of Giedi Prime is a euphemism that requires no elaboration. Gurney's attempt to protect her, or to find her, or simply to refuse the reality of what was happening brought him to the attention of the wrong people at the wrong time. And so the pits received him. He was perhaps in his late teens when he first descended into those carved limestone passages, young enough to still carry the full weight of hope, old enough to understand exactly what he was losing. The limestone pits of Giedi Prime were a masterwork of suffering. They extended downward in a series of terraced levels, each one darker and more airless than the last. The upper levels receive some filtered light from above, pale and industrial, but enough to remind a man that the surface existed. By the time you reached the mid-levels, you were working by artificial illumination alone, lamps powered by the same Harkonnen generators that ran everything on the planet, casting a yellowish light that made every face look hollowed out and sick. The deepest levels received nothing but the heat rising from the planet's geological core and the sound of picks against stone, a rhythm as relentless and impersonal as a heartbeat. The work itself was physically annihilating. The slaves extracted limestone blocks by hand tools, using picks and chisels and wedges to break free sections of rock that were then hauled to the surface through a system of rope and pulley contraptions that were just sophisticated enough to be efficient and just primitive enough to break regularly, usually at the worst possible moment. The dust was the real enemy. Limestone dust accumulates in the lungs with patient determination, building up layer by layer over months and years, until breathing becomes first laborious, then painful, then impossible. The Harkonnens understood this perfectly. A pit slave with more than 3 years of deep-level exposure was a liability, not an asset. Turnover was not a problem to be solved. It was a feature of the system. The guards who oversaw the pits were drawn from the lowest tier of the Harkonnen military hierarchy, men who had demonstrated a particular talent for cruelty and a complete absence of anything resembling restraint. They were given quotas, daily extraction targets that the slaves were expected to meet, regardless of heat, exhaustion, injury, or grief. When the quotas were not met, the guards had tools at their disposal, shock batons, starvation protocols, and most notably, the Inkvine whip. The Inkvine is a plant native to Giedi Prime, and it is one of the few organic things that seems to thrive in that planet's industrial atmosphere. It grows in dense, ropey clusters along the outer walls of certain Harkonnen installations. Its vines thick and gnarled, and covered in a fine coating of chemical resin that the plant produces as part of its own defense mechanism against predators. That resin is the relevant detail here. When an Inkvine whip, crafted from the processed and cured vines of this plant, makes contact with skin, it does not merely cut, it deposits that chemical compound directly into the wound. The result is a burn that goes deeper than the laceration itself, spreading through subcutaneous tissue with a slow, deliberate malice that can continue causing damage for hours after the initial strike. The wounds it leaves do not heal cleanly. The chemical interaction with human tissue creates a kind of permanent discoloration, a darkening and thickening of the scar tissue that gives the healed wound a quality unlike any other scar. Under normal light, an Inkvine scar appears as a jagged, darkened line. But under certain spectra of light, particularly in the bluish illumination found in some Harkonnen facilities, the scar glows, faintly, sickly, like a buried ember refusing to die. It is this luminescent quality that made the Inkvine whip the preferred tool of Harkonnen overseers. It marked permanently and visibly. A man or woman bearing an Inkvine scar could never entirely hide the fact of what had been done to them, or who had done it. Gurney received his scar from Glossu Rabban. This is not a small detail. This is the centerpiece of his history. The moment that calcified everything that had been building in him since his first descent into the pits. Glossu Rabban, known across the Imperium as Beast Rabban, was the nephew of Baron Vladimir Harkonnen and the man given administrative oversight of Giedi Prime's labor operations during this period. He was not a subtle man. Where the Baron operated through layers of strategy and psychological manipulation, Rabban was a creature of direct and enthusiastic violence. He inspected the pits with the particular pleasure of a man who has found his calling. He was large, physically imposing in the way of someone who has spent their life unchallenged, and he had a habit of carrying an Inkvine whip, not merely as a tool of discipline, but as an accessory, something to trail against the stone walls as he walked, something to snap in the air simply because he could. The encounter that produced Gurney's scar has been described in various ways across the Dune canon and its expanded materials, but the core of it is consistent. Rabban was walking an inspection of the mid-level pit operations when something in Gurney's bearing caught his attention. This is one of those details that tells you everything about both men. Most slaves learned very quickly to make themselves invisible during an overseer's inspection, to keep eyes down, to regulate breathing, to become as close to part of the stone as possible. Gurney apparently could not or would not perform this particular art. There was something in the set of his shoulders, or the angle of his jaw, or perhaps simply the fact that he was humming very quietly, something melodic, that drew Rabban's gaze. Rabban struck him across the jaw with the Inkvine whip. Whether this was a calculated act of disciplinary messaging or simply an impulsive expression of irritation, the effect was the same. The whip opened a wound from the corner of Gurney's mouth to just below his ear, depositing its chemical payload into the gash, and Gurney went down into the limestone dust. He did not cry out. This is the detail that appears in the recounting of people who were allegedly present, and it is the kind of detail that, whether historically precise or retrospectively applied, carries genuine psychological weight. He did not cry out, and this apparently frustrated Rabban, who expected a response and did not receive one. What Gurney gave him instead was something far more unsettling. He got back up. That was the moment. Not the moment of the wound, the moment of the rising. The years in the pits that followed the scarring were not defined by that single act of physical defiance. They were defined by something slower, deeper, and ultimately more dangerous. They were defined by Gurney's decision to survive not merely physically, but wholly, to refuse to allow the pits to take from him the things that made him who he was. Chief among those things was music. The Baliset, a 9-string instrument with a body shaped somewhere between a lute and a primitive guitar, had been part of Gurney's life since childhood. He could not, obviously, bring an instrument into the pits. The Harkonnens were not running a cultural enrichment program, but he carried the music in his memory with the same devotion with which a man in the desert carries water. He remembered every ballad, every folk melody, every half-finished composition he had ever known. And in the hours when the overseers were not directly above him, in the deep stretches of the night shift when the supervising guards were drowsing at their posts, Gurney would work with one part of his mind and compose with another. The rhythm of the picks against limestone became a drumbeat. The creaking of the pulley systems became a bass note. The labored breathing of the men around him became a choir of sorts, unwilling but present. And Gurney wrote songs in his head and stored them there with fierce proprietary care. There is something almost defiant in the absurdity of it. In the middle of one of the most systematically dehumanizing environments ever devised by human civilization, a young man with a chemical burn across his jaw was composing ballads. The Harkonnens had designed the pits to strip everything away. The music was everything, but it was not merely escapism. This is a common misreading of Gurney's relationship with music, particularly in interpretations that reduce him to a simple contrast of gentleness and violence. The music was not a retreat from the pits. It was a response to them. The verse he composed in those years was not soft or comforting. It was kinetic, rhythmically aggressive, full of images of stone and fire, and the particular quality of light that filters down through industrial air. He was not writing his way out of the pits. He was writing the pits into something that could be carried. This is the paradox that defines Gurney Halleck, and that the Inkvine scar embodies more completely than any verbal description ever could. He is gentle, and he is lethal. He is a lover of beauty and a specialist in ending things. And these are not opposite tendencies that coexist in uncomfortable tension. They are the same thing, expressed through different channels. The music and the violence both come from the same source, the absolute refusal to be diminished. Now, to understand what the pits made of him, we need to understand what they took from him first. Gurney was not alone in the pits when he arrived. He had connections, people he knew, possibly family members or neighbors from his original settlement who had been swept into the same system at various points. The pits were not designed to preserve social bonds. They were designed to dissolve them. People were moved between levels without warning, assigned to different crews, transferred to other facilities across Giedi Prime when the administrative math required it. The social fabric of the slave population was kept deliberately thin and torn. Gurney watched people die. Not in battle, not in any context that could be assigned meaning through the traditional frameworks of sacrifice or heroism, but in the small, grinding ways that the pits specialized in. A man who had been breathing the dust for 2 years too long, whose lungs simply filled past their capacity one morning while he was swinging a pick. A woman who stumbled on the upper rope platform and went over the edge in the time it took to blink. A boy, possibly not yet 16, who caught a fever in the deep levels where the heat from below met the cold air from the ventilation shafts and produced a sick thermal zone, and who was not attended to because attending to sick slaves was not a priority in the Harkonnen operational ledger. He watched these things and he did not become numb to them. This is crucial. Numbness would have been easier, and the pits produced it in many people, a kind of sealed-off flatness that was the psyche's last defense against overload. Gurney's response was different. He became more sensitized, not less. Each loss sharpened rather than dulled his emotional register. The grief accumulated, but did not petrify. It remained liquid, mobile, available for transformation. And it transformed into something very specific. It transformed into hate for the Harkonnens, for the system they had built, for the casual arithmetic by which they assigned human lives to industrial outputs. But it also transformed into something more complex and more interesting than simple hate. It transformed into a fierce, protective tenderness toward everything worth protecting in the world, toward music and loyalty and the specific quality of laughter that survives in dark places, toward the idea of a house that operates on different principles than the Harkonnens, toward the possibility, still theoretical at this point, of a lord worth serving. That theoretical lord would eventually have a name. That name was Leto Atreides. But first, the escape. The canonical record is deliberately sparse on the mechanics of how Gurney got out of the Harkonnen slave pits. Herbert was not particularly interested in escape narrative mechanics, and the specific details of the breakout are more fully elaborated in the prequel novels authored by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson, which draw on Frank Herbert's notes and expand the period of Gurney's enslavement with considerable textual detail. What is clear is that Gurney did not simply wait for an opportunity and then run. The escape was the product of years of careful observation, of the kind of patient, disciplined intelligence that the pits had, ironically, cultivated in him. He learned the rhythms of the guard rotations. He learned which overseers were most susceptible to distraction and when. He learned the geography of the upper pit levels and the surface access points with the same methodical care that he had applied to learning combat techniques, which he had also done in the pits, absorbing everything he could from anyone who had useful knowledge, trading what he knew for what he needed. He got out. That much is the foundation. He came up from the limestone pits of Giedi Prime carrying nothing but the music in his head, the scar on his jaw, and a hatred for House Harkonnen that was so complete and so precisely calibrated that it had moved beyond emotion into something closer to architectural principle. It was the load-bearing structure of everything he would become. The path from the pits to the service of House Atreides was not a straight line. There is a period in Gurney's history that might be described as his wandering years, a span of time during which he operated on the margins of Giedi Prime's shadow economy, making his way through a combination of mercenary work and musical performance in establishments that ask no questions about a man's history, and the kind of improvised survival that people with his particular skill set were capable of. He was dangerous by now in ways that went far beyond mere physical capability. He was dangerous the way a long-burning fire is dangerous, steady, controlled, and capable of tremendous output when circumstances allowed. It was during this period that his skills as a fighter were formalized, trained up from the raw and brutal competence of the pits into something approaching the artistry of a trained soldier. He sought out teachers. He studied the fighting systems of multiple traditions with a particular focus on the swordsman's disciplines that were increasingly relevant in an imperium where the widespread use of personal shield technology had shifted combat back toward blade work. He was an exceptional student, not because of any particular physical gifts, though he was strong and fast, but because he brought to combat training the same quality he brought to music. He listened. He internalized structure, he understood rhythm, his reputation grew in the specific way that reputations grow in the underground economies of repressive planetary systems. Word of a fighter with a scar on his jaw and a ballad for any occasion spread through the networks of people who needed both of those things and knew better than to ask where he had acquired either. It was this reputation that eventually reached the ears of agents working on behalf of House Atreides. Duke Leto Atreides I was a man who understood something fundamental about the relationship between leadership and loyalty that the Harkonnens had never grasped and would never grasp. The Harkonnen model of command was built on fear and the constant demonstration of the consequences of failure. It worked in the limited sense that it produced compliance. But compliance and loyalty are profoundly different things. And the distinction becomes critical precisely when it matters most. When the situation is desperate, when the cause seems lost, when continuing to fight requires something from a person that no amount of fear can compel. Leto built differently. He understood that the people around him needed to choose him, genuinely choose him, in the full knowledge of what that choice entailed. He did not inspire loyalty through spectacle or through the manipulation of sentiment. He inspired it by being, consistently and without performance, exactly what a lord should be. He was fair. He was honest about the dangers he was leading his people into. He treated the soldiers and vassals around him as human beings with their own dignity, their own histories, their own worth that existed independently of whatever use they could be to him. When Gurney Halleck came into the orbit of House Atreides, he arrived as a man who had been defined by his hatred of everything the Harkonnens represented. And what he found in Leto was not merely the absence of those things, but their precise opposite. Where the Harkonnens had used their power to diminish and destroy, Leto used his to build and protect. The effect on Gurney was something close to a second birth. He rose through the Atreides military structure with a speed that was less a product of ambition than of simply being, at every level, the best available person for whatever the next task required. His combat skills were exceptional. His strategic understanding, sharpened by years of observing and analyzing systems of control and resistance in the pits, was sharp and practical. But what really distinguished him, what set him apart in a way that eventually made him War Master, was his ability to inspire. Gurney Halleck, with a Baliset in his hands and a ballad on his lips, could reach into men who were exhausted and frightened and depleted and pull something out of them. Not by pretending the fear was not real, but by making the thing they were fighting for feel real enough to overcome it. He trained the Atreides soldiers not just in the mechanics of combat, but in the meaning of it. He taught them to fight for something rather than against something, though he himself had begun from the opposite position. He had spent years being fueled entirely by what he was against, the Harkonnens, the system. Rabban's face above him as the whip came down. But in the service of House Atreides, he discovered what he was for, and it made him more dangerous, not less. The Inkvine scar on his jaw was not concealed during his years with Atreides. He made no effort to cover it and no apology for its presence. It sat on his face as a piece of information, available to anyone who cared to read it. New recruits to the Atreides military who did not know his history often made the mistake of treating it as an ordinary scar, a battle wound of some kind. And the story they eventually got when they asked about it was always the same, told simply, without drama, in the same matter-of-fact tone Gurney used for everything. That was made by a Harkonnen Inkvine whip in a slave pit. I was a slave. I am not anymore. Now pick up your blade because I am about to show you something. And it was in this context that the scar took on its secondary meaning. It had begun as a mark of degradation, placed on him by a casual act of Rabban's cruelty. It had been transformed by Gurney's survival and escape into a mark of endurance. And in the service of House Atreides, it became something else again. It became a teaching tool. It became a reminder, visible in every briefing, in every training session, in every moment, when Gurney stood before Atreides soldiers and told them what they were preparing for. The scar said, "I have been where the Harkonnens put people, I have seen what they do. I am standing here, and you will train hard enough that when the moment comes, you will be standing too. Paul Atreides grew up with Gurney Halleck as one of his primary teachers, and the relationship between them is one of the richest in the entire Dune saga. Gurney taught Paul to fight, and he taught him with the same combination of genuine affection and absolute refusal to go easy on him that characterized everything else Gurney did. He would quote verse in the middle of a sparring session. He would stop a combination mid-sequence to correct Paul's hand positioning, and then immediately begin singing a ballad about the last Atreides lord who forgot to protect his sword hand. He was exasperating and brilliant and completely devoted. Paul recognized the Inkvine scar from his earliest years. It was one of the first pieces of adult history he understood. He knew what it meant before he fully grasped the political context of the Harkonnen and Atreides conflict, because Gurney wore it every day and because the scar carried with it a quality that children are very good at reading. It carried weight, not sadness, or at least not only sadness, but significance. This happened. This was real. This matters. And then the Harkonnens came for Arrakis. The fall of House Atreides, the betrayal, the night raid on Arrakeen, the dispersal and apparent destruction of everything Gurney had built and given himself to is one of the great catastrophes of the Dune narrative. For Gurney, it was layered with an almost unbearable specificity of loss. He had come from a place of total defeat and built himself and helped build something extraordinary. And then it was taken by the Harkonnens. Again. The years following the fall, during which Gurney survived as a spice smuggler in the deep desert regions of Arrakis, running with the outlaw bands that operated in the open erg, were years of a particular kind of darkness. He believed Paul and Lady Jessica to be dead. He believed Leto to be dead, which was true. He believed that everything he had dedicated himself to since leaving the pits of Giedi Prime had been erased. The Inkvine scar on his jaw, which had been a teaching tool and a badge of purpose in the Atreides years, must in those smuggler years have felt again like what it had originally been, a Harkonnen mark. Evidence that the Harkonnens win. But they did not win. The reunion with Paul, when it came, was one of the most emotionally complex moments in the Dune books. Gurney, who had received inaccurate intelligence suggesting that Jessica was responsible for the betrayal of House Atreides, came very close to killing her. The scene in which Paul physically intervenes to stop Gurney from acting on his mistaken certainty is written with tremendous power because it crystallizes everything about what Gurney is. He is loyal unto death. He is operating on the belief that he is serving the memory of Leto by protecting Paul and punishing betrayal. And he is wrong in the facts, but not in the principle. The loyalty is genuine and absolute. The information was simply false. That moment, and its resolution, marks the point at which the Inkvine scar's narrative function shifts for the final time. Gurney has been wrong in a way that could have been catastrophic. He has been shown, by the young man he trained, that his certainty can be a weapon pointed in the wrong direction. And he accepts this correction with the same quality he brought to everything else. Without self-pity, without prolonged guilt, with a practical acknowledgement of what had almost happened and a redirection of everything he had toward the task ahead. The confrontation with Rabban is not rendered in the Dune canon as a single dramatic duel. It does not end in a specific scene where Gurney stands over his tormentor and speaks a final sentence and closes a chapter. The resolution is more diffuse and in some ways more complete than that narrative structure would allow. Rabban is killed during the uprising on Arrakis, during the planetary revolution that Paul and the Fremen mount against Harkonnen control. He is not killed by Gurney specifically. He is killed in the collapse of the system he represented. This is actually more satisfying if you think about it from Gurney's perspective. The target of his vengeance was never really Rabban the person, though Rabban is the face attached to the memory of the Inkvine whip. The target was the whole structure, the Harkonnen order of things. The world in which a limestone pit on Giedi Prime could consume human lives by the thousands and have this accepted as normal. The destruction of that world, the overthrow of Harkonnen rule on Arrakis, the death of Rabban in the chaos of a revolution that Gurney helped to make possible. This is the vengeance, not personal, total. The Inkvine scar does not disappear when the Harkonnens fall. It remains on Gurney's jaw exactly as it always was. The chemical compound locked permanently into the tissue, the faint glow still present under certain lights. This is appropriate. The scar was never meant to go away. It is not a problem to be solved or a wound to be healed. It is a record. And records do not erase themselves simply because the events they document are over. What is the lasting lesson of Gurney Halleck? What does his history, from the limestone pits of Giedi Prime to the spice sands of Arrakis, actually tell us about the endurance of the human spirit under systemic evil? It tells us several things, and none of them are comfortable or simple. It tells us that survival is not passive. The people who endured the Harkonnen pits were not only the ones who kept their heads down and made themselves invisible. They were also the people who found something inside themselves that the pits could not reach. For some, that was simple stubbornness. For Gurney, it was music. But the music was not a comfort mechanism. It was a practice of personhood, a daily insistence on being more than what the system had classified him as. It tells us that hatred, even the most righteous and justified hatred, is not sufficient as a foundation for a life. Gurney was fueled by his hatred of the Harkonnens, and that fuel was real and useful. It drove him out of the pits and through the years of survival and into the service of a house worth serving. But the fullness of his life, the richness of it, came not from the hatred, but from the things he was for. The music, the loyalty, the young man he helped to train, the ideal of a different kind of leadership. The hatred was the ignition. The love was the engine. And it tells us, finally, that the marks we carry from the worst things that have been done to us are not in themselves shameful or diminishing. Gurney Halleck wore his Inkvine scar on his face for the entirety of his adult life. In every great hall he walked into, in every council chamber, in every training ground where he stood before men half his age and showed them what he knew. He wore it without apology and without explanation, unless explanation was useful. The scar was not evidence of his weakness. It was evidence of what he had survived and what he had built from the surviving. There's a detail in Denis Villeneuve's film adaptation of Dune, released in 2021 and 2024, that is worth pausing on in this context. The casting of Josh Brolin as Gurney Halleck and the visual treatment of the Inkvine scar give it a slightly different quality than some earlier interpretations. In the film, the scar is a constant presence, textured and real, never glamorized, never made to look like an accessory. It sits on his face the way a memory sits in a mind. Present, specific, never far from the surface. Brolin's performance communicates something that the text can only describe, which is the quality of a man who has integrated his damage rather than buried it or overcome it. The damage is part of the structure now. It is weight-bearing. The prequel novels, Dune House Atreides and its successors, give us a more detailed look at the pits themselves and at the specific circumstances of Gurney's time in them. These books are sometimes criticized for over-explaining mysteries that Herbert left deliberately ambiguous, and that criticism has merit in certain places. But the elaboration of Gurney's history in the slave pits is, for the most part, a valuable expansion. It gives the Inkvine scar a context that makes its later presence in the primary novels more legible. When you have read about what happened in those carved limestone passages, when you have been given the specifics of the dust and the dark and the rhythm of the picks, the scar on Gurney's jaw in the Dune novels is not just a narrative shorthand for this character has suffered. It is a precise reference to a precise history. The Inkvine scar is, in the end, the most efficient piece of characterization in the Dune saga. It tells you Gurney's origins in a single visual detail. It tells you his enemies. It tells you something about the nature of Harkonnen cruelty, which does not merely harm, but brands, which does not merely punish, but marks, which is not content to hurt a person, but insists on being credited for the hurt it causes. It tells you about Gurney's refusal to be ashamed of what was done to him. It tells you about the kind of soldier he is, one who carries his history openly, who does not pretend that the world is cleaner or safer than it is, who tells the people he is training exactly what they are preparing to face because he has faced it and he is still standing. And it tells you something about Herbert's understanding of what war and oppression actually do. People. They do not simply create victims or heroes. They create complicated, damaged, magnificent, musical, violent, loyal, grief-stricken, and joyful human beings who carry their histories in their bodies and their songs and their fighting styles, and who refuse, with every performance of the Baliset and every precise placement of a blade, to be reducible to the worst thing that ever happened to them. There's one final image worth holding on to as we close. In one of the most quoted passages surrounding Gurney Halleck across fan and critical writing on Dune, it is observed that he is a man who can be moved to genuine tears by a piece of music, and who can, in the same afternoon, take another man's life with complete efficiency and without hesitation. And that these two things are not in conflict. They are both expressions of his capacity for total commitment. When Gurney loves something, he loves it all the way down. When Gurney opposes something, he opposes it with every tool at his disposal. The Baliset and the blade are the same instrument played in different keys. That wholeness, that integration of the tender and the terrible, is the product of the pits, not despite what happened there. Because of it, the Harkonnens tried to break him down into his component pieces, to reduce him to a body that could extract limestone and nothing more. What they produced instead was a man who could not be divided, who carried his gentleness directly alongside his ferocity, because separating them would have meant losing both, who sang because the singing was itself an act of defiance, who fought because the fighting was itself an act of love. Gurney Halleck is the warrior-troubadour of Arrakis, the war master of House Atreides, the man who put Paul through his paces with a sword in one hand and a verse on his lips, and one of the most beloved characters in one of the most celebrated science fiction sagas ever written. And all of that, every single piece of it, began in the darkness of a Harkonnen limestone pit, with the hiss of an Inkvine whip, and a young man who got back up. The scar is still there. It will always be there, and that is exactly as it should be.